It was a dark, quiet night, the kind where the woods seemed to hold their breath. I had been hiking for several days, making my way through a remote stretch of forest. I'd found a perfect little spot near a creek to set up camp. The fire had long since burned out, and all that was left were the glowing embers, casting faint shadows on the surrounding trees. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I had been in the wilderness long enough to know how the night could feel both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. I crawled into my sleeping bag, adjusting my position for comfort. I had a good spot, protected by a cluster of trees with my tent facing the creek. I had set up the fly on the tent to keep out any rain, but it still allowed a little bit of starlight to peek through, illuminating the ground outside in soft, silvery patches. The camp had been quiet all night, but as I lay there, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but a feeling of unease settled in my stomach like a cold stone. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. No distant owls hooting, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. The kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to shake the feeling. The night felt heavier now. The weight of it seemed to press down on me, making the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. My mind raced with thoughts of every possible thing that could be out there. It wasn't uncommon to hear a bear or some other animal in the distance, but this felt different. I could sense it. Something was wrong. Something was too still. I sat up, pulling my sleeping bag around me as I reached for my flashlight. But before I could move, I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, just beyond the mesh of the tent. I froze, my heart immediately slamming in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or some animal, but whatever it wasn't normal. My eyes stayed locked on the spot where I'd seen the movement, waiting, hoping it was nothing. But the night remained completely still. And then I saw them, two glowing eyes. At first, I thought they might have been the reflection of the stars or maybe the light from the campfire, but no. These were unmistakably eyes. Clear, yellow, unblinking eyes, staring back at me from just outside the camp. I held my breath, completely still, barely daring to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My stomach knotted, and my skin prickled with a sudden cold. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stared, unblinking, directly into the mesh of my tent. I couldn't make out any other shape around the eyes. The glow was too bright, and it was hard to focus. They were almost unnatural, too intense. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each beat louder than the last. My body was frozen, locked in place, unable to move or look away. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew deep down that this wasn't some curious animal. It felt intelligent, like it was watching me, studying me, waiting for something. The forest around me was completely quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not a single sound. It felt like the whole world had paused, holding its breath along with me. I wanted to reach for my phone, my flashlight, anything, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet, stay still, but fear was gripping me tightly, making my hands sweat. Time passed slowly, or maybe it didn't pass at all. It felt like hours, though I knew it had only been a few minutes. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They stayed fixed, steady. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but the fear that was crawling under my skin was growing by the second. My mind raced through possibilities. Mountain lion, maybe a bear, but why wasn't it making a sound? Why weren't the other animals reacting? I knew the forest around me well enough to know that animals usually make noise when they're close. I should have heard something, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, anything, but nothing. It was like the world had gone completely silent, and the only thing that existed in that moment was those eyes. I felt a wave of dizziness, my head swimming. My body was screaming at me to move, but my mind kept telling me to stay still. If it was some sort of predator, I didn't want to give it any reason to approach. If I moved, if I made any sound, it might trigger something. My thoughts raced. I had no weapon on me, just a pocket knife buried in my backpack, and my car was parked a half-mile away. Couldn't run. I couldn't escape fast enough if whatever this was decided to come closer. My breathing became shallow as I watched those eyes, waiting for them to do something. Anything. They remained locked on me, unwavering. I felt like they were studying me, almost calculating. What did it want? Why wasn't it attacking? Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the eyes blinked. The movement was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A single blink. My heart skipped a beat. It felt like the air shifted, like something had changed, but the eyes remained locked on me. The moment was unbearable, stretching out like an eternity. My fingers clenched around the sleeping bag, my nails biting into the fabric as I held on to whatever shred of composure I had left. I kept my gaze fixed on the eyes, afraid to look away. My mind screamed for me to act, to run, to do anything, but my body was still paralyzed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the eyes started to move, sliding to the right. I could barely see them through the mesh now, but I knew they were moving. The sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, that it was just something curious, but nothing made sense anymore. The eyes stopped moving, lingering just out of sight. I waited, listening for anything, trying to pick up a sound, a movement, a clue, but there was nothing. A soft thud from somewhere near my tent broke the silence. It was so quiet, but it sounded like something heavy had just stepped into the underbrush, its weight pressing down the leaves. My pulse spiked again, and my eyes snapped back to the spot where the eyes had been. I saw nothing now. The only sounds were the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, there was wind again, and I could hear it. My body felt like it was still vibrating with fear, but it was also exhausted, drained from holding still for so long. I waited, my breath steadying, trying to listen for any sign of movement. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the eyes were gone. They had disappeared. The spot where they had been was empty, the darkness stretching on. I waited a moment longer just to be sure, but there was no sign of them. I slowly, carefully exhaled, realizing that I had been holding my breath the whole time. I hadn't even noticed how tight my chest had become, how shallow my breathing was. After what felt like hours of sitting in the dark, motionless, I allowed myself to take a slow, trembling breath. I reached over and grabbed the flashlight from my pack, flicking it on with a shaky hand. I sat there for a few moments, scanning the area, but I didn't see anything. There was no movement, no sounds of whatever had been out there. Finally, I unzipped the tent flap, stepping out into the cold night air. My feet crunched softly against the dry leaves and pine needles as I moved around the camp, checking the perimeter. There were no tracks, no signs of anything unusual, just the quiet of the woods. It wasn't until I started packing up my camp the next morning that I realized how close I had been to something. Maybe it had just been a curious animal. Maybe it had been something else. But I was sure of one thing: I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was watching me, waiting, and for some reason it hadn't attacked. And that alone was enough to leave me shaken, questioning what really lurked in the dark corners of the wilderness. It was deep into the night when I lay still in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The kind of sounds that make the night feel both alive and completely alone at the same time. The chirp of crickets, the distant rustle of wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig under some unseen animal's weight. I had been camping in this part of the woods many times before, and it was one of those places where you felt safe, surrounded by nothing but nature. No cell service, no streetlights, just the stars and the moon for company. My only concern that night had been to get some sleep, as I had a long hike planned for the next day. But sleep didn't come easily. Every now and then, I'd shift, readjusting myself on the thin sleeping bag, but something kept pulling my thoughts away from the comfort of sleep. The woods outside felt a little different, quieter than usual. I chalked it up to my own nerves. Being alone in the woods at night can do that to you sometimes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence, so thick it almost seemed to press against my ears. I was just starting to drift off when I saw it. A light. At first, I thought it was the glow of a flashlight, possibly another camper out there. I wasn't the only one in the woods, but I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail earlier in the day. The light was far off in the distance, flickering like it was being waved back and forth. It was soft at first, almost like a small, distant firefly, but it stayed in the same spot, unmoving, flickering with a strange rhythm. My heart skipped a beat. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out there. The nearest campsite was miles away, and there were no roads close enough for someone to be walking around with a flashlight at this time of night. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my own flashlight, clicking it on and unzipping the door of my tent. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting me instantly. The woods felt unusually still, as though the whole forest had gone silent in response to the light. I could hear the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees above me, but it seemed muffled, like the sound was trapped in the thick air. The light was still there, far in the distance, its flicker barely visible through the trees. It seemed to hover just past a clearing, like someone was standing there, shining the beam up into the air and letting it fall back to the ground, but there was no movement, the kind of stillness that felt wrong. I swallowed, unsure of what to make of it, and started walking toward it. I knew the area well enough to navigate without a map, so I kept my bearings, walking through the dense underbrush with my flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. Every now and then, I'd look up and catch a glimpse of the distant light, but it never seemed to get any closer. The more I walked, the less it felt like I was heading toward it, and the more I began to feel like I was being pulled away from my own campsite. The forest seemed to stretch out further, the trees and shadows becoming denser the farther I went. Minutes passed, and the light seemed to stay where it was, flickering but not moving. It was odd. I began to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe it was just some reflection from a distant campfire or something that had caught my eye in the dark. But when I reached the clearing, the light was gone. Just like that, the clearing was completely empty. No sign of anyone, no flicker of light, just the quiet hum of the woods around me. My breath felt like it was stuck in my chest as I stood there for a long moment, scanning the trees and the dark spaces between them. There was nothing, just the silence. I should have gone back to my tent right then, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was the kind of silence that almost hurt your ears, the kind that feels like it's pressing in on you from all directions. I turned around, scanning the forest behind me, thinking maybe I had missed something, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark trees and the distant sound of the wind whispering through the leaves. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I suddenly felt very small, very alone, standing in the middle of that empty space. I was about to take a step back, to turn and head back to my tent, when I heard it. A voice. It was quiet at first, a faint murmur through the trees, like someone calling from far away. It took a moment for my brain to process the sound, but when I realized what it was, my heart stopped. It was my name. I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It came from deeper in the woods, just out of my line of sight. There was no mistaking it. Someone was calling my name. I stood there, rooted in place, feeling my pulse race in my ears. My first thought was that it was someone else in the woods, someone lost or in trouble. But why didn't they call out for help? Why just my name? And why did it sound so wrong? It was the kind of voice that didn't belong in the woods, the kind of voice that made everything feel unreal. I strained my ears, listening harder. The voice called my name again, a little louder this time. My name, clear and sharp, hanging in the stillness of the night. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I had been alone in the woods enough times to know what it felt like when something was off. I had been lost, scared, and even a little paranoid before, but this was different. This felt deliberate, like something was out there waiting for me. My eyes darted around the clearing, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. No movement, no figures. The woods seemed completely still, save for the faint rustle of the wind. I could still hear my name being called, though faintly drifting through the trees. It was as if the voice was coming from a distance, yet somehow, at the same time, right beside me. It was too quiet, too calm, too deliberate. There was nothing panicked about it, just my name. I turned back toward my tent, every nerve in my body telling me to run, to get out of there. But I didn't move, couldn't. The voice, that calm, deliberate call, seemed to be rooted in the very air around me. I took another step backward, still searching the trees. The silence pressed down on me again, thick and heavy. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I called out, not knowing why. "Hello!" My voice sounded so small in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the faint sound of the wind in the trees. Another voice, this time a different sound, a low, guttural hum. It was like something or someone was trying to mimic human speech. The noise made my skin crawl, and I took another step back, this time turning completely toward the path I had walked in on. I needed to get out of there. I turned quickly, not looking back, and started to walk fast. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the woods around me, closing in, pressing against me with every step. I didn't dare run. I couldn't risk tripping in the dark, but I couldn't walk fast enough. I was almost back to the campsite when the voice called again, sharp and clear in the distance. But this time, it wasn't my name. It was a sound I could barely describe. A soft click of a tongue followed by a strange laugh. It echoed in the trees, sharp and foreign. And that's when I realized something I hadn't understood before. I wasn't alone in the woods. I broke into a sprint, not daring to look back. I ran as fast as I could, barely keeping my footing as I pushed through the underbrush. The trees seemed to shift around me, their branches reaching down as if to grab me, to pull me back into the darkness. I made it back to my tent, throwing myself inside and zipping the door closed behind me. My breath came in heavy, gasping bursts as I tried to steady myself. I sat there in the dark, heart racing, staring at the single beam of light my flashlight had cast on the inside of the tent. The world outside felt like it had shifted in some strange, impossible way. It was hours before I felt safe enough to fall asleep. The voice never came back. The light never appeared again. The forest around me felt normal, still, and quiet once more. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. The forest had a way of keeping its secrets, and it didn't share them lightly. The next morning, I packed up my camp early and left. I didn't want to be there any longer. I still don't know what I heard that night, but one thing's for sure. There are some things in the woods that you can't explain, no matter how hard you try. And sometimes it's best not to try at all. It was one of those clear nights in the woods, the kind where you can see every star in the sky, and the fire crackled happily beside me, the scent of burning wood filling the air. I had set up camp by myself, far away from the usual hiking trails, deep in a patch of forest where the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of the trees in the gentle breeze. The firelight flickered and swayed, casting warm, orange light across the ground, while the rest of the world seemed swallowed by the thick darkness. I leaned back against the log I had pulled close to the fire, feeling the heat on my face. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cool night air that brushed against the back of my neck. I stretched out my legs, my boots resting on the pine needle-covered earth. I was completely alone out here, just how I liked it. A few hundred yards from the nearest trailhead, the only company I had was the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind moving through the trees. I didn't need to be afraid. I had camped in places like this before. I was used to the sounds of the forest, the way it came alive at night, and how it always seemed to watch, whether you were aware of it or not. I had spent nights out here with only my thoughts and the stars above, but tonight something felt off. The fire crackled and popped, sending a few sparks flying into the air. I kept my gaze on the flames, but a weird sensation washed over me, something I couldn't quite place. It started small, barely noticeable at first. It felt like a tickle in the back of my mind, as though I was being watched, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the normal quiet weirdness of being in the woods at night. As the minutes passed, however, that feeling grew stronger. The firelight was steady, but something felt wrong about the shadows. I turned my head slightly, keeping my back to the fire, and watched the silhouettes of the trees in front of me. They should have been still, the shadows remaining solid and unmoving. But they weren't. The shadows were shifting, stretching unnaturally in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was just the fire playing tricks, the light flickering and making the shadows dance. But it didn't seem right. The shadows stretched across the ground in strange angles, like they were being pulled and distorted, even though the flames hadn't shifted at all. I rubbed my eyes, figuring I was just tired from the long hike in, but when I looked again, the shadows were still moving. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about it didn't feel natural. The way the shadows twisted and flickered in odd directions made my gut tighten, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. I wasn't used to this feeling. I was a seasoned camper. I'd been in the woods plenty of times before, but this was different. I turned slightly to face the fire again, trying to calm myself. It had to be the light, just the fire messing with my eyes. I watched the flames flicker again, but when I glanced back to the trees, the shadows hadn't stopped moving. They stretched in odd ways, sometimes elongating, sometimes shrinking, twisting in a way that made no sense. They weren't just dancing anymore. They were shifting and stretching even when the firelight remained steady. My heart started to beat a little faster, the unease creeping in. I stood up slowly, hoping the change in position would help shake the feeling. But when I moved, the shadows didn't stop. They still moved and swayed. I couldn't take my eyes off them now. I turned my body fully, my back to the campfire, and I leaned forward to get a better look. The shadows were still there, but they didn't seem to belong. They were too fluid, too erratic. As I stared at the dark shapes between the trees, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. For just a moment, right on the edge of the firelight, I thought I saw something or someone. Standing in the dark, just beyond the reach of the light, I froze. It was a figure, human-sized, standing tall and still in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but it was there, just outside the light. My first instinct was to look away, to convince myself it was just another trick of the light, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about it felt wrong. It didn't belong. I blinked hard, and the figure was gone. I felt a rush of cold air sweep over me, though the night had been still only moments before. My stomach lurched, and a sense of dread started to sink into my bones. I turned around quickly, focusing on the warmth of the fire, but my mind raced. What had I seen? The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, clung to me like a thick, suffocating fog. I looked back to where I had seen the figure. The firelight was still strong, casting long shadows across the ground, but the trees beyond the ring of light seemed even darker now. The whole forest felt suffocating, like it was holding its breath. It was silent, too silent. The wind had stopped, and the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, were gone. It was like everything had frozen. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and steady, and I didn't dare look back into the shadows again. Instead, I grabbed a long stick from the ground and poked at the fire, making the flames jump higher. It was a small thing, but it made me feel better, like I had some control over the situation. The fire crackled and popped, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to shrink, returning to their more familiar shapes. But that feeling didn't go away. It lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I couldn't sit still anymore. I had to do something. I stood up and started pacing around the fire, not wanting to let my back face the dark forest for too long. I kept my eyes flicking to the trees, expecting to see something moving in the shadows, but all I saw were the normal shapes of the night, nothing out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the one I had thought I saw standing just beyond the firelight. The image was burned into my brain, and no matter how many times I looked into the darkness, I couldn't convince myself that it wasn't real. Minutes stretched into hours. My watch told me it was well past midnight. The fire had died down a little, but I kept adding more wood, trying to keep the flames strong. Couldn't let the light dim. I needed it to stay bright. The dark was too much. The shadows felt like they were creeping closer, inch by inch. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack, my flashlight, and decided I'd rather head back to the trailhead, even if it was dark, than stay here another minute longer. I packed up as quickly as I could, stuffing things haphazardly into my bag. I kept glancing nervously at the edge of the camp, where the shadows stretched long and dark, but I forced myself to look away each time. I was almost ready to leave when I heard something, a rustling noise. It came from the trees, just beyond the ring of light. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something heavier, something deliberate. The rustling moved closer, and I felt my throat tighten. It was like whatever was out there was circling me, just out of reach of the firelight. My flashlight shook in my hands as I turned toward the sound. I shined the beam into the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. But all I saw was darkness. No movement, no figure, nothing. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I grabbed the last of my gear. I didn't care if I was leaving things behind. The sound of rustling grew louder, closer, but I didn't look back. I was done. The camp was a thing of the past. I wasn't staying out here another second. I moved quickly, my heart racing, making my way through the darkened forest with only the flashlight to guide me. The shadows seemed to press in around me, the trees looking like dark figures watching from the edges of my vision. The flashlight beam flickered in the distance, illuminating just enough of the trail ahead for me to stumble along. As I reached the trailhead, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was out of the woods, but as I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself, I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone, that whatever had been out there was still watching me. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I didn't even look back at the dark forest. But as I drove away, the rearview mirror caught a glimpse of something, just a flicker in the trees, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I never went back. I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy steps, crunching against the ground, pacing around my tent. It was still dark, the kind of blackness that only the woods can create, the air thick and damp with the chill of early morning. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it. My heart was already pounding in my chest, but it was more from the unease that was settling in than any actual fear. The sounds didn't make sense. There wasn't anyone else out here. I knew that for sure. I had chosen this spot for its seclusion, far from any trail or campgrounds, deep in a quiet, remote corner of the forest. The closest road was miles away. The only thing I was supposed to be sharing this space with was the occasional deer or maybe the sound of an owl calling out in the night. Certainly not someone walking around my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, trying to discern anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. The steps were getting closer, circling around the tent now, deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was trying to figure something out. I could hear each footfall like it was being amplified by the silence around me. A twig snapped to my left, and my dog, Max, shifted beside me, his body tense. I could feel the low rumble of a growl vibrating through him, though his voice was quiet and careful, like he was trying not to give away our position. Max was never like this. He was a brave dog, fearless even when we hiked through rough terrain or passed by wild animals. He had chased off smaller critters before, and he didn't flinch at much. But tonight, his fur was bristled, and his low growl was almost a whisper, but deep, something far darker than the playful noise he made when he was just excited about a squirrel. He was scared, and that made me scared. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, my senses straining. Maybe it was just an animal, a bear, or something else. I tried to tell myself that. But the thing was, bears didn't make that kind of sound. Bears were heavy, but not like this. These steps had purpose. There was intent behind them. Someone or something was trying to figure out how to get closer to me, to my tent, to us. My fingers tightened around the sleeping bag, my knuckles turning white as I waited. Minutes passed, felt like hours. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't shake. Could it be another camper? Someone who had wandered off the trail? But no, that didn't make sense. No one else was out here, not this deep in the woods. My pulse thudded louder than the footsteps, the sound echoing in my head. Whatever was out there was still out there. I could feel its presence, but I had to stay quiet. I couldn't risk making a noise. Not yet. The heavy steps returned, moving slowly again, circling around the tent. They paused once, right at the door of the tent. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to look out through the mesh of the door to see if I could spot anything, but I didn't dare. I didn't move, not even a fraction. My dog was still growling, quieter now, but still unmistakable. I gently placed my hand on his side, feeling the tremor that was running through him, his body stiff as a board. He was scared, and that scared me more than anything. The silence stretched on, and then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps stopped. Just like that, the pacing, the sound of movement ceased. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. No sound, no more footsteps, just the stillness of the night. Time passed. I couldn't tell how long. Minutes? Hours? My eyes were wide, my body frozen in place, barely daring to move or even breathe. The only sound was the beating of my heart and the low growl of Max beside me. But the steps had stopped. Whatever had been out there had moved on, or so it seemed. I told myself that. I wanted to believe it, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Couldn't. My mind kept running through possibilities, trying to make sense of what had happened. Could it have been a person? Maybe someone in the woods who had lost their way, and I just happened to be the closest thing to investigate? But no, that didn't fit. There was too much purpose in the steps, too much precision. Eventually, the first light of morning began to break through the trees, the darkness slowly giving way to gray. I could hear the birds waking up, the rustle of leaves as the wind began to stir. The woods were coming alive again, and that brought me some comfort. Still, I didn't dare to move from my tent for a long while. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside was still watching, waiting. Finally, around mid-morning, I gathered enough courage to unzip the tent. The air outside was cool, crisp, and the forest looked serene, untouched by whatever had happened during the night. The birds were singing in the trees, and the sunlight dappled the ground through the leaves, casting a peaceful glow over everything. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a dream. The logical part of me was saying that it must have been, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I packed up camp slowly, my eyes constantly scanning the woods around me, not fully trusting the silence. Max stayed close, his nervous energy making him jump at the smallest noise, his ears constantly twitching. I didn't know if it was because of the night or just the general sense of unease we both felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I was careful as I broke down my tent, making sure I didn't leave anything behind. I took my time packing up my gear, always glancing around. I didn't know why I was so on edge, but I felt it in my bones. I couldn't leave fast enough, but I couldn't stay either. I was drawn to the idea of getting out of there, but the woods felt like they were pulling me back, reminding me of the uncertainty of the night. My breath quickened with each movement, my hands trembling slightly as I stowed away my tent and gear. When I finally finished packing everything up, I took one last look around the clearing. The forest stood still, silent, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything that would explain the events of the night before. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was leaving. I wasn't going to stick around and wait for whatever had been circling my tent to come back. I hiked out in a hurry, my boots crunching against the ground, my mind constantly on alert, eyes darting back and forth, watching for any movement, any sign that something or someone was following me. Every step I took felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, the forest remained still, nothing but the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I reached my car, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I slammed the door shut, locking it without hesitation, and sat for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The forest was behind me now, but the feeling of being watched, the tension in the air, lingered. Even with the windows rolled up and the engine running, I couldn't shake the unease. I drove away slowly, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following. But nothing ever did. As I left the woods behind me and made my way back towards civilization, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a bad night, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew I'd never be able to explain it away. I couldn't deny what had happened, what I'd felt, and I couldn't help but wonder, what had been out there, and why had it stopped? I sat by the fire, the flames dancing and crackling, sending off the occasional spark that flickered out before it could drift too far. The heat was welcome on this cool autumn evening, the kind where the air smells crisp and fresh, and the shadows of the trees stretch long across the forest floor. I had set up camp deep in the woods, a spot far from the usual crowds, where I could enjoy the solitude and the peacefulness of being alone with nature. The world around me was quiet, save for the sounds of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant call of an owl. It was a good night, perfect night for camping. I took a slow sip from my water bottle, letting the cool liquid settle in my stomach. The fire's warmth had a kind of hypnotic effect on me, and my eyelids were starting to feel heavy. I glanced at the trees around me, their silhouettes looming in the firelight. There was nothing to be afraid of, just the forest, peaceful and still, as it always was. And then that's when I heard it, a faint whispering, coming from beneath the ground. It was so quiet at first that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard anything at all. I paused, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, a soft, muffled sound, like someone speaking, but the words were too faint to make out. The sound seemed to come from deep beneath the earth, like it was rising from the ground itself, as though the very dirt was whispering to me. I felt a chill creep up my spine, though the fire's warmth should have kept it at bay. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination, or perhaps the wind shifting through the trees and rustling the leaves in a way that made it sound like voices. But then the whispering came again, clearer this time, though still far too faint to understand. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone, it was insistent, like whatever was speaking beneath the earth wanted me to hear it. My heart began to beat a little faster. I couldn't explain it, but something about it didn't sit right. The sound seemed to be drawing me in, like a lure I couldn't resist. I set down my water bottle and stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands, my eyes scanning the area around the fire. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows, stretching long into the night. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a trick of the mind. But that whispering, there was something about it that felt deliberate, like it was meant for me. I stepped closer to the fire pit, my eyes scanning the ground, looking for any sign of where the sound might be coming from. The firelight flickered across the dirt, casting strange, shifting shadows, but there was nothing in the ground that looked out of place. Just the usual dirt and ash, the remnants of the fire I had built. But then, I heard it again, louder this time. The words weren't any clearer, but there was no mistaking the direction it was coming from. It felt as though the whispering was coming from directly beneath me, as if something or someone was calling from under the earth. I swallowed hard, my hands suddenly trembling. My curiosity got the better of me. Without thinking, I knelt down beside the fire pit, using my hands to scoop away the dirt around the edge. My fingers scraped against the rough soil, pulling away the earth and revealing more of the pit. The whispering grew louder, but it was still impossible to make out the words. It sounded almost frantic now, as though the voice, or whatever it was getting more desperate, urging me to keep digging. I hesitated for a moment, a voice in my head warning me to stop. But the whispering was so compelling, so strange, that I found myself continuing to dig. The dirt came away easily at first, but the further I went, the harder the ground seemed to become. It was as though the earth itself didn't want me to get any deeper. My breath quickened as I worked, my fingers aching from the effort. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the chill in the air, and my heart raced as I continued to pull away the soil. With each handful of dirt I removed, the the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer just a faint murmur, but a steady, constant sound that seemed to be coming from directly beneath me. The words still eluded me, but there was no mistaking the urgency now. I was being called. Something wanted me to keep digging. I paused, my hands trembling as I stared at the hole I had created. The earth was still, silent for a moment, and I could feel the weight of the forest around me. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. What if I was digging into something I shouldn't? What if I was disturbing something that was better left alone? But then, the whispering came again, louder and more insistent. I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close. So I dug deeper. The soil shifted and crumbled under my hands, and I could feel something solid beneath the surface. My heart skipped a beat as I dug away the final layer of earth. And then I found it. The object was half buried, just beneath the surface of the ground, its shape almost unrecognizable. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. It was a small box, wooden and old, covered in dirt and grime. I reached out and touched it, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips. The whispering had stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. I pulled the box out of the ground carefully, brushing the dirt off it. It was heavier than I expected, and the wood creaked as I held it in my hands. My pulse raced as I turned it over, inspecting it closely. The box had strange markings carved into it, symbols I didn't recognize, as if they had been etched into the wood with some kind of care. The box looked ancient, and yet, there was something unnerving about it, like it didn't belong here. I felt a strange compulsion to open it. Without thinking, I fumbled with the latch, my fingers shaking as I tried to release it. The metal was cold and stiff, but after a few moments of struggle, it clicked open. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find inside. But I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. I lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking in the still night air. Inside the box was a collection of old, weathered objects. A handful of small stones, each one different from the others. A scrap of cloth torn and faded with age. A piece of paper, crumpled and yellowed, with something written on it in a language I couldn't read. But it wasn't the objects that made my heart skip a beat. It was what lay at the bottom of the box. A small, human-like hand, preserved in the dirt. I recoiled in shock, dropping the box in my lap as a surge of panic shot through me. The hand was small, delicate, with fingers curled as if it had been frozen in time. It looked too real to be a prop, too lifelike. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. The whispering started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from beneath the earth anymore. It was coming from the box, or rather, from the hand inside it. The voice was clearer now, though the words were still indecipherable. A jumble of sounds that felt alien, like they were reaching out to me from some distant place, calling to me in a language I couldn't understand. I slammed the box shut, the sound of it ringing in my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled backward, almost falling into the fire. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the box, my mind racing. What had I just uncovered? What was that hand? Why did it feel like something was watching me? The fire crackled softly, the flames flickering as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around me had changed. The silence was heavier now, the air thick with tension. The trees seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here anymore. With trembling hands, I gathered my things as quickly as I could, not caring if I left anything behind. I couldn't risk staying another moment in this place, not after what I had found. My heart was still racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess as I hurriedly packed my gear, the fire slowly dying behind me. I didn't look back, couldn't. I left the forest that night, walking away from the fire, the box, and the whispering voices that still echoed in my mind. I didn't know what I had disturbed, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out, and I never went back. had just finished a short hike, something simple to stretch my legs. The sun was beginning to set, and the cool evening air felt good against my skin as I made my way back to camp. The trail wound through a small patch of woods, and the terrain was uneven but nothing too difficult. As I walked, I heard the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots, the distant call of a bird, and the gentle rustling of branches swaying in the wind. It was the kind of peaceful day that makes you appreciate the quiet of the forest, a rare kind of solitude that makes everything feel a bit more alive. I was looking ahead when I noticed a figure atop a hill in the distance, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was another camper, perhaps someone finishing a hike or enjoying the view. I gave a casual wave, my hand lifting instinctively in greeting, but the man didn't move. His body remained rigid, and I couldn't make out much from that distance. But what struck me immediately was his eyes. They were locked onto me, fixed with an intensity one couldn't quite explain. They didn't wander or shift, just stayed on me. My initial thought was that it was odd. Who stands still like that? But I dismissed it quickly. Maybe he was just taking in the view, or perhaps he was tired, not wanting to move too much. Either way, I kept walking. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It was like my every step was being calculated, my every movement observed. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But there was something in the way he stood, so unmoving and silent. He didn't even have a backpack or any of the usual gear that most campers carry. His posture was stiff, and his clothes, if they could even be called that, looked worn, like they hadn't seen a good wash in years. But more than that, it was the way his eyes didn't blink, just staring at me. I walked a bit faster, my heart picking up speed as I took another glance over my shoulder. The man didn't budge. He was still there, the outline of his figure standing stark against the fading light of the sky. My instincts were starting to kick in. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I had camped alone before, I had hiked alone before, hell, I had spent nights in far more remote places. But this felt different. A nagging feeling began to crawl up the back of my neck, and I forced myself to turn around and focus on the trail ahead. Just get back to camp, I told myself. Everything's fine. But I couldn't let it go. I felt like his gaze was still on me, like it was following me with every step. I glanced back again. This time, the man was gone. The hill was empty, no sign of him at all. I squinted into the fading light, thinking maybe he had just moved behind a tree or down the other side of the hill. But there was nothing, just empty space where he had been standing. My chest tightened. I don't know why I felt so unsettled. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still, like something unnatural. Or maybe it was the way his eyes had locked onto me, like he was trying to memorize my every movement. Either way, my gut told me something was wrong. And now that he was gone, the unease only grew. I quickened my pace even more, my legs working faster than they should have. But it felt like the only thing that could get me out of this creeping discomfort. The only thing that would help me get back to the safety of my camp. I told myself that it didn't matter. He was probably just some old guy out for a walk. Maybe he didn't even notice me, and I had overthought the whole thing. Maybe he just wasn't interested in making small talk. But I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, his eyes boring into mine. The trees around me began to grow denser as I moved further down the trail. I could hear the sounds of the forest surrounding me. The breeze whispering through the branches, the occasional chirp of a cricket, the faint rustling of a squirrel in the underbrush. Everything was normal, but I still couldn't shake that feeling in my gut, like I wasn't alone, like something was off. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, but when you turn around, there's no one there. I reached a clearing, the path now visible to my camp in the distance. Relief started to settle in, but that nagging feeling was still there, tugging at me. I walked faster, not wanting to stop until I was at my tent, safe and sound, and could finally get some peace. But the deeper I got into the clearing, the more I felt it. I had stopped looking behind me at this point. There was no point in doing so anymore, but the unsettling sensation of being watched never left. As I neared my camp, I saw the flicker of my campfire in the distance, the familiar warmth welcoming me. I felt a little safer, but I also felt like I couldn't let my guard down just yet. My eyes scanned the area around me, looking for any sign of someone or something. My heart rate slowly began to return to normal, but the nerves in my chest hadn't quite settled. Then, as I stepped into the clearing where my camp was set up, I froze. I wasn't alone. At the edge of the camp, near the small pile of firewood, stood the man. He wasn't staring at me from the top of the hill anymore. He was standing just inside the clearing, almost as though he had been waiting for me. His clothes were the same as before, the worn, ragged look still evident. And once again, his eyes were fixed on me, staring like he was seeing straight through me. My body stiffened. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. I had no idea how long he had been standing there. Maybe he had been following me from the hill. I didn't know, and at that moment I didn't care to find out. The sight of him, this man who had been so still, so silent, was enough to make my heart race in fear. But before I could even open my mouth to speak, he turned away. Slowly, deliberately, as if he had no care in the world. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, didn't even look back. He simply turned and began walking away, moving toward the tree line and vanishing into the woods. My body finally moved, and I rushed to my tent, locking the flap behind me. I sat there, staring at the fire, the sound of the crackling flames filling the silence. My mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. What had that been? Why had he been following me? What was he doing out here alone, with no gear, no pack, no nothing? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every rustle in the trees, every crackle of the fire. The image of his eyes, cold and unblinking, stayed with me long after the man had disappeared. The next morning, I packed up and left as soon as the sun was up, my nerves still on edge. I never saw the man again, never heard any news of him, and honestly, I never camped there again. There are places that just feel wrong, and that hill, that man, that feeling, they all stayed with me long after the trip ended. Sometimes I wonder if he was just a strange old man out for a walk, or if there was something more to it. But one thing's for sure. That day, the feeling of being watched was as real as the trees around me, and I still don't know what it was about him that scared me so much. It started softly, just a whisper on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the breeze playing tricks on me, but the voice became louder, clearer. "Help me." The words wrapped themselves around me, cutting through the still night air like a razor. I stopped, mid-step, frozen. My heart raced as my brain scrambled to make sense of what was happening. I had been camping alone, deep in the woods, no one around for miles. I chose this spot for its solitude, hoping to get away from everything, to clear my head for a few days. The quiet had been comforting up until now, but that voice was everything but comforting. I looked around, hoping to find the source of the sound, but the surrounding forest was silent. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The trees loomed tall, casting long shadows in the moonlight. There were no other campers, no hikers around, just me and the voice. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long day of hiking, and maybe I was just exhausted. But then, the voice came again, louder this time, clear as day. "Help me." It sent a chill up my spine. No mistaking it. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't the trees creaking. Someone or something was in trouble. I grabbed my flashlight from the tent, my hands shaking. I had to check. Couldn't have been real, but I couldn't just sit here and ignore it. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the uneven trail that led into the woods. I walked quickly, the sound of my boots crunching against the dry leaves and twigs in the underbrush the only noise now, drowning out everything else. The voice had come from further into the woods, so I pushed on, each step heavier than the last. It didn't take long before the trees began to close in around me, the underbrush getting thicker. I was deep in now, the flashlight struggling to cut through the tangled mess of branches and bushes. I could still hear the faintest echo of the voice in my mind, but there was no sound in the air anymore, just the wind and me, and the growing feeling that something wasn't right. I paused for a moment, scanning the area. Nothing. Not a single movement. I strained my ears, hoping to hear it again. The wind had picked up, but the voice had disappeared. It was as if it had been sucked into the night, swallowed whole. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening, trying to convince myself to turn around and head back to the safety of my camp. But something kept me rooted to the spot, some primal instinct telling me not to leave. Not yet. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. And then I heard it again. This time it was closer, a whisper so soft, it was almost drowned out by the wind. "Help me!" I jerked around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam flickered out. Damn batteries. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to twist the cap and replace them with the spares in my pocket. My hands were slick with sweat, but I managed to get the new ones in. The light flickered back on, weak at first, but then steady. I took a deep breath and kept moving forward. The voice hadn't come again, but the silence in the air felt suffocating. I pushed through the brush, the flashlight now bobbing up and down as I walked. The trees around me seemed to get denser, more imposing. I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me just out of sight. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath me was soft, spongy, and damp. The usual dry, crackling forest floor was gone, replaced by thick, wet moss. The smell of earth was heavy in the air, and my flashlight picked up glistening droplets on the leaves above. Had it rained recently? I hadn't noticed it on the trail earlier. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why hadn't I heard the voice again? Where was it coming from? Was I just imagining it? The idea that it could be something else, the voice of someone who was really in danger, kept gnawing at the back of my mind. But still, no sign of anything. No one. The forest had swallowed the voice. There was nothing left but me, alone in the dark. I was about to turn back when I saw something up ahead. In the distance, a faint glow. I thought it might be the reflection of my flashlight on something, but it was too steady, too bright. I approached cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. The glow grew brighter as I drew near, revealing what appeared to be a small clearing ahead. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what was casting the light. A fire, a small campfire, barely burning, was flickering in the clearing. I could see the faint outline of a tent nearby, but there was something wrong about it. The fire wasn't warm. There was no heat radiating from it. It was cold, like the whole clearing had been frozen over. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I moved toward the fire, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the flames didn't seem to match up with the objects around it. The shadows were too long, stretched in unnatural ways. I squinted, trying to make out the details. That's when I saw it. A figure, hunched over in front of the fire, its head lowered. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Was it a person? A man? A woman? The figure didn't move. No sounds. Just the crackling of the fire. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. What was it doing here? How had it gotten here? Then the figure moved, slowly, as if it was forced to, like it didn't have control. It rose from its crouched position, turning its head toward me. The face was gaunt, pale, eyes wide and unblinking. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just stared. I opened my mouth to call out, but no words came. My throat had gone dry, the fear overwhelming. The figure didn't approach, didn't even move a step closer. It just stood there, watching me. The air felt thick, like I was suffocating. The silence between us stretched on, an eternity of nothingness. I thought I saw the corners of its mouth twitch, just the faintest hint of a smile. That's when the voice came again. "Help me." I flinched, spinning around to face the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No one behind me, just trees and the lingering chill of the night air. When I looked back toward the figure, it was gone. The fire was out. The clearing was empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Couldn't. The cold air wrapped itself around me, sending shivers down my spine. Slowly, I turned and made my way back through the woods, trying not to look over my shoulder. By the time I reached my camp, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I forced myself to sit down, to breathe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. I spent the rest of the night in my tent, wide awake, listening for any sign of movement outside, but nothing came. The forest outside was quiet, too quiet. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing, ragged and fast, trying to steady itself. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know if it was real, but whatever it was, it felt too real, too wrong. I won't be coming back to this place again. It was late, and the night was heavy with silence, thick and suffocating. The only sound I could hear was the occasional rustling of leaves, disturbed by the slight breeze, and the soft hum of insects in the warm air. I'd spent the day hiking, setting up camp by a small creek that twisted through the dense forest. It had been a long, exhausting day, and I was more than ready to crawl into my sleeping bag and try to get some rest. The tent was snug, the heat of the day still lingering in the fabric, and I could hear the faint sound of the creek flowing outside, the only thing that kept me from feeling completely alone. I zipped myself into my tent, flicking off the headlamp and letting the darkness settle in. The smell of pine and damp earth wafted in through the small cracks of the tent, and the sound of the forest felt far away, muted by the layers of fabric. I tried to settle in, my mind drifting into a half-dreamy state, the fatigue pulling me closer to sleep. But then, something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a flicker of light reflecting off the fabric of the tent. I had my headlamp in my bag, and I hadn't turned it on since crawling into my sleeping bag, so I figured it was just a random glint from somewhere outside. But then it happened again. Flash. Not bright, but enough to catch my eye. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. I lay still, watching, not sure whether it was a trick of the light or something else. The flash came again, and this time I recognized it for what it was. Eyes. They were too round, too bright, too intense to be just a reflection. They were staring straight at me from the darkness, about 6 feet away from my tent. I could see the faint outline of a shape, but the darkness made it impossible to make out anything beyond those 2 piercing points of light. The eyes didn't move, just blinked slowly, lazily. It was a deliberate, almost mocking motion, as if they were aware of me, aware that I was watching them. My heart slammed into my chest. I held my breath, my body frozen in place, barely daring to move. The tent fabric felt thinner now, as if it couldn't protect me from whatever was outside. I stayed absolutely still, barely even blinking, hoping the figure would move away. I was wide awake now, adrenaline flooding my veins, my mind racing for answers. Was it a bear? A deer? Something bigger? But the way those eyes stayed fixed, unmoving, felt wrong. No animal, at least none that I had encountered in the woods before, would just sit there, eyes glowing, staring at me in the middle of the night. I tried to control my breathing, to keep it steady, but my chest was tight, and each breath felt louder than the last. I knew I couldn't make a sound. I dared not move, dared not rustle the tent, afraid that even the smallest sound would provoke whatever was out there. The eyes blinked again, slow and deliberate, like they were calculating, waiting for something, waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't a bear, not with the way it crouched, low to the ground, its shape more defined in the darkness. The way it sat, crouched, almost hunched, with its eyes still locked onto me, felt wrong, like something unnatural. I couldn't make out much more than the shape, but I could sense its presence, its focus. It was aware of me, watching me with an intensity that made the air feel even thicker. My thoughts scrambled to find a reason, an explanation, but nothing made sense. I had camped in remote areas before, spent countless nights in the woods, but never like this. Never with something watching me so closely, so deliberately. The silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive. Every breath felt louder, Every tiny noise outside the tent seemed amplified. I strained my ears, listening for any sounds of movement, any indication that whatever was out there was leaving. But there was nothing, just the steady beating of my heart and the distant trickle of the creek. I tried to focus on that sound, to calm myself, but my gaze was fixed on those eyes. They didn't blink again, didn't move, and the shape stayed crouched, still and silent. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do, what to make of the situation. Was it waiting for me to make a move? Should I get my knife? My gun? But I couldn't make a sound. Even the slightest rustle of the tent, even the softest movement, could provoke something I didn't understand, and I wasn't ready to find out what it might be. I thought about what to do next. If it was an animal, I could probably scare it away with a loud noise or by flashing my headlamp at it. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something else? Something that wasn't scared by light or noise? The way it crouched, almost as if it was waiting for me to do something, felt too calculated. It didn't seem like an animal, seemed too aware. The silence stretched on, unbearable now. My heart was still pounding, my breath still shallow. I tried to convince myself it wasn't anything, that I was just being paranoid, that it was some sort of trick of the light or my imagination. But every time I tried to look away, my eyes would be drawn back to the shape, to those eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, just as slowly as they had appeared, the eyes blinked again. Once, twice, and then the figure stood up. I didn't even realize I had been holding my breath until the air rushed back into my lungs in a sharp gasp. I wanted to move, wanted to do something, but I stayed still, too afraid to make a sound. I watched as the shape stood up fully, stretching tall, its movement slow and deliberate. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. I could make out the shape of limbs, human-like but somehow wrong, elongated and unnaturally still. The figure didn't come closer. It just stood there, still, as if waiting. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved. The figure didn't run or make any aggressive motions. Instead, it took a step backward, disappearing into the shadows, the eyes slowly fading from view. The movement was almost graceful, like it had been waiting for me to react, to make the first move. But when I didn't, it left. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my eyes never leaving the spot where the figure had been, half expecting it to return. But the night remained silent, still, and after a long time, I finally let out a shaky breath. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my hands trembling as I reached for my headlamp. I didn't want to get out of the tent, but I knew I had to. I needed to see if it was still out there, or if it had really gone. I slowly unzipped the tent, peeking out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the forest nearly pitch black. The only light was from the dim glow of my headlamp, but there was nothing. No eyes, no movement, just the soft whisper of the trees swaying in the wind. I didn't wait long. I packed up my things as quietly and quickly as I could, trying to keep calm, but every rustle of fabric felt louder than it should have. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I didn't feel safe staying in the area, and I wasn't about to find out what might happen next. I left the campsite as soon as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to be away from there. The forest had felt familiar before, a place I had spent so many nights, but now it felt alien, felt wrong. As I walked away, I kept my head down, my eyes scanning the woods around me, but there was nothing. No eyes watching me from the darkness. Nothing that would make sense of what I had just experienced. By the time I reached the nearest ranger station, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I told them what happened, but I couldn't explain it any more than I already had. There were no tracks, no sign of anything unusual, just the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness. They didn't have an explanation, but they didn't dismiss my story either. I was given a different spot to camp that night, far from where I had been, but I didn't stay there long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching, waiting. I never went back to that area, never camped there again. The memory of those eyes still lingers, but I don't know what they were or why they watched me. All I know is that it felt real, and I felt the weight of something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Something patient, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I was deep in the forest, about 10 miles from the nearest road. I had parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off that barely fit one vehicle, then hiked in along an old logging road, long since overgrown with alder and young spruce. The map I had showed no designated campsites, no trailheads, nothing official. That's exactly what I was looking for. Just a quiet night in the woods. Solitude, a break from the buzzing world. It was late September. The air was crisp, but not yet freezing. I'd chosen a flat patch of ground near a slow, shallow creek. There were no signs of people anywhere. No wrappers, no footprints, no chopped logs or fire rings. Just forest with a few clearings where the sun cut down through gaps in the canopy. The silence was heavy, so much so that when a raven croaked somewhere far off, it made me jump a little. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, gathered a pile of downed wood, and laid out a circle of rocks to build a fire pit. I had brought a small hatchet, just enough to split the thick branches I found into manageable pieces. Once the fire was going steady and the coals were hot, I set my small pan over it and started heating up a simple dinner. Some canned beans, a few strips of bacon, and a bit of stale bread I had toasted on a stick. The smell was thick and smoky and warm. I remember being hungry from hiking all day. I was kneeling beside the fire, turning the bacon with a stick, watching the fat sizzle and pop. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the flames. A shape, maybe the shadow of a tree, caught in my peripheral vision. But it looked too solid, too symmetrical. I looked up, and in the reflection of the firelight across from me, on the other side of the fire, maybe 15 feet back, stood a figure. It was just a shape, dark against the darker trees. I couldn't see any details. No face, no clothes, nothing distinct. Just the outline. It didn't move. It didn't shift. I stared at it, frozen, the stick still in my hand, bacon still hissing in the pan. Then I turned to look directly at it, and it was gone. The space beyond the fire was empty. The trees stood still. No rustling, no footsteps, no movement, just firelight flickering against bark and leaves. I stood up slowly. My legs were stiff from kneeling. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness. The forest beyond the campfire was pitch black. My headlamp was clipped to my tent pole, and I didn't want to step too far away from the fire to get it. So I grabbed my flashlight from my jacket pocket, flicked it on, and started sweeping it across the trees. Nothing, no shape, no person, no eyes reflecting back. Just trees and ferns and the endless, thick dark between them. I walked around the fire's edge, the stick still in my other hand, like that would do anything if someone was really there. Still, I saw nothing. But the weirdest thing was, when I looked back at the fire, that reflection was still burned into my brain. The exact height, the stance, the outline. Like someone had been standing there, right at the edge of the firelight, watching me. The fire cracked and shifted behind me, and I spun around again. Still nothing. I stood like that for maybe a full minute, just listening. All I could hear was the popping of the fire and my own breathing. The forest was too quiet. No insects, no wind. Even the creek sounded muffled, like it was flowing through a pillow. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowly backed toward my tent. The pan still sat on the fire, the bacon burning now. I didn't care. I just wanted the headlamp. I unclipped it from the tent pole, strapped it around my head, and turned it on. The stronger beam lit up more of the woods, casting long shadows behind every tree. I kept sweeping the beam around, looking for anything, any movement, any shape, any sound. But there was nothing, not even tracks. I walked a wide circle around the camp. The ground was dry but soft with pine needles. If anyone had stepped there, I'd have seen it, but I didn't see a thing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was a burnt log or a strangely shaped tree stump. Maybe my eyes had caught a shadow that wasn't there. I told myself a lot of things to explain it away because the alternative was worse, that someone had been standing there watching me and slipped away without a sound. I sat back down, poked at the burnt bacon, and ate it anyway. I didn't feel hungry anymore. The fire felt too small, the woods too big. I fed a few more logs into the flames and tried to keep my back to something solid. My tent, a thick tree, anything that made me feel a little less exposed. I didn't sleep right away. I stayed up until the fire burned down to orange coals. I kept the headlamp on and set it beside me so I could grab it quickly. I listened, watched, waited. Eventually, I got tired. The kind of tired that doesn't ask for permission. I climbed into my tent, zipped the door shut, and laid on my sleeping pad. The forest outside felt too loud now. Every small crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like footsteps. But nothing happened that night. The next morning, the sun came through the trees like nothing had happened. Birds chirped, the creek gurgled. The woods came back to life like they always do when the light returns. I made coffee and ate a granola bar. Still, I kept glancing toward the trees, to the spot where I'd seen the figure. There was no sign of anyone ever having been there. But that wasn't the end of it. As I packed up camp, I walked out past the fire pit and into the woods behind it. I just wanted to look, just in case. I walked about 20 feet into the trees, sweeping my eyes across the forest floor, and then I saw something that made my stomach turn. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly, but the pine needles in one spot had been disturbed, pressed down in a rough oval. Could have been where a person stood, right where the figure had been. I knelt down and looked closer. There were no shoe prints, but something had been there, something heavy enough to press down the ground. I looked up, scanning the trees. Nothing again. I left camp without looking back. The hike back to my truck felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound behind me made me glance over my shoulder. Every squirrel darting through the brush made me flinch. I didn't run, but I walked fast, my pack bouncing against my back. When I finally saw the road and my truck, I felt a wave of relief I can't even describe. I threw my gear in the bed, slammed the tailgate shut, and climbed in. Locked the doors without even thinking. My hands were shaking. Driving back, I kept thinking about what I saw, the shape, the stillness of it, the way it didn't move even when I turned, and the impression in the pine needles. Someone had been there, watching me. But here's the part that stuck with me the most. A few weeks later, I went back to that area. I don't even know why. Curiosity, I guess. It had rained since then. The fire pit was still there, the rocks blackened. But the woods felt different. Not bad, just empty. I walked out to where the impression had been. It was gone, of course. But when I turned to go back to my truck, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. About 30 feet away, near the base of a tree, was a pile of broken branches, stacked neatly. Too neatly, like someone had arranged them. It didn't look natural. I didn't stay long, just long enough to take it in. I haven't camped in that spot again. I still go out, still sleep in the woods, but I'm more careful now. I keep my flashlight closer. I scan the tree line more often, and I never ignore my gut anymore, because that night someone was out there. I didn't see their face, didn't hear them move, but I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. That wasn't just a shadow. Someone was watching me, and they were close, too close. I had been planning the trip for months. Nothing fancy, just a solo weekend out in the national forest, a little off-grid break to clear my head. I'd chosen a spot I found on a topo map, about 5 miles down a rough game trail from the nearest fire road. No campground, no bathrooms, no fire pits. Just thick trees, dry leaves underfoot, and the kind of silence that only exists when you're really far from everything. I parked the truck around noon and hiked in with my gear. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a compass, map, and a general sense of where I wanted to set up. It took me the better part of 3 hours to reach the spot. A small clearing nestled between 2 ridges, ringed by pine and a few gnarled oaks. The sun broke through just enough to warm the clearing without cooking it. Felt perfect. I pitched my tent near the far edge, facing out toward the slope. About 15 feet away, I laid my backpack on a flat rock under a tree. I didn't want to keep it in the tent with me since I had some food in there, and I've had enough mice chew through my gear in the past to know better. I hung my bear bag a bit farther out, maybe 50 yards from the tent, slung high in a pine with a decent counterweight. The first day was uneventful. I gathered some downed wood for a small fire, cooked up a freeze-dried meal, and sipped on some water mixed with powdered Gatorade while watching the trees turn gold in the setting sun. There was no wind, and the silence felt heavy, but not in a bad way, just quiet. Still, I went to bed just after dark. No fire. I don't like drawing attention to myself out there at night. I lay in my sleeping bag with my headlamp off, listening to the small sounds of the forest, branches settling, something small digging or scuttling nearby, the distant call of an owl. I drifted off without much trouble. The next morning, I got up around 7. It was cool, a little fog hanging low in the trees. I stretched, stepped out of the tent, and looked over at my backpack. It had shifted. It wasn't a huge change, just off. The top flap, which I'd clipped down, was now open. The pack was tilted slightly, like it had been pulled or nudged from the side. I crouched beside it. Nothing seemed torn. I thought maybe a raccoon or something smaller had poked around. But the zippers were mostly closed, and my food bag was still hanging. Maybe I just hadn't clipped it right. I shook it off and ate breakfast. Instant oats and a cup of coffee from my old battered percolator. I spent most of that day hiking around the area. I found an old deer trail that led down into a gully with a dry creek bed. Some big cat tracks in the dust. Older ones, but still good to know. Around 2 or 3 p.m., I made it back to camp and sat on a rock-eating trail mix. I looked over at my pack again. It had moved. This time, I knew it wasn't me. I'd left it leaning up against a log with the straps facing outward. Now it was on its side, about a foot from where I'd left it. One of the zippers was partially open. Not torn, just opened. I checked inside. My water bottle was unscrewed, cap loose, dribbling a bit into the fabric at the bottom. One of my granola bars was gone. At first I figured maybe a raccoon had figured out the zipper, but the bottle cap being off, that threw me. That's not the kind of thing a critter would mess with unless it chewed through the plastic, which hadn't happened. I stood still, listening to the woods. The air felt a little tighter somehow. Still quiet, but the good kind of quiet had shifted. This one had a weight to it, like being watched. I told myself it was just me overthinking things, probably from too much time alone. I re-zipped the bag, secured the flap tight, and placed it inside the vestibule of the tent this time. Not in the sleeping area, but close enough that I'd hear anything messing with it. That evening, I skipped the fire again. A cold dinner. Sat watching the tree line until dark settled in thick. I kept my headlamp off longer than usual, trying to let my eyes adjust to the dark, listening harder than normal. Still nothing. No footsteps, no branches snapping, no breathing in the brush. When I finally went inside the tent, I zipped it up tight. I kept my knife and small flashlight by my sleeping pad. I even kept my boots on, which I never do. I lay there for a while, mind running in circles. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard something. Rustling, not far off. Leaves moving, not the way wind moves them, but like something walking through. It came from the side of the tent where the vestibule was. I held my breath and listened. Whatever it was moved slowly, deliberate. A shuffle, then a pause. Then another shuffle. I reached slowly for the flashlight. My hand trembled as I clicked it on and shined it through the mesh of the inner tent wall. The light hit the fabric of the vestibule but didn't show anything directly. The rustling stopped. I waited, silent, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Then, from the edge of the trees maybe 15 feet out, I heard a low growl. It wasn't a bear. I've heard black bears up close before, and this was different. This was lower, more guttural. Less snort, more throat. Didn't bark, didn't howl. Just one long, low warning. And then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stayed frozen with the flashlight in my hand, beam pressed against the fabric, watching shadows twitch in the still branches. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I didn't hear it leave. No footsteps going away. No rustling retreat. Just silence again, heavy and tense. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of the tent until the sky began to pale outside. At first light, I unzipped the door and looked out. My pack was gone. Not just moved, gone. No sign of it anywhere around the tent. I stood up, heart hammering again, and scanned the area. I found it about 30 yards away, half buried under some brush, like someone had tried to cover it. A few branches laid over it, sloppily. The straps were twisted, and one of the pockets was fully unzipped. My first aid kit was missing. My backup flashlight too. I checked the ground. No clear footprints, but something had definitely been moving around. Some scuffed earth, displaced leaves, twigs broken in a weird arc. I took the pack back, rechecked everything, then packed up the rest of my gear. I knew I should stay another night. I'd planned 2 nights out, but something in my gut was telling me no, that I didn't belong there anymore. I hiked out with my head on a swivel, checking behind me every few minutes. I heard nothing the whole way. No birds, no animals, not even squirrels. The forest was too quiet, like whatever had been there had scared everything else off too. I made it back to the truck just after noon. I tossed my gear in the back, locked the doors, and drove until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I was back in town. When I got home, I laid everything out in the garage and went through it piece by piece. A few more things were missing: my multi-tool, some paracord, and the fire starter. All easy to take, easy to carry. All things that could be useful. It didn't feel like an animal. Animals don't care about tools. They chew, they rip, they eat. This felt different. I didn't report it. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have a name to give or a face to describe. Just the memory of that growl and the way my pack had been dragged off, half hidden under the brush like a stolen wallet tossed aside. Since then, I haven't camped alone again. Not deep in the woods, anyway. I still go out sometimes, but I stick to known trails near campgrounds where other people are close by. I still carry the same knife, though, and I've added a little more weight to my belt when I hike. I try not to think too hard about what was out there, whether it was a person or something worse, something human but not right in the head. Someone who knows the woods, who waits until night to move, who watches and takes only what they want. And if it was a person, then what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent? If I'd called out again? If I'd stepped outside, thinking I could scare them off? I don't want to know. I just know I listened to my gut, and I got out, and that's probably why I'm still here. I woke up to a strange sound, not loud, just the sort of thing that stirs you out of sleep in the woods when you're alone. A kind of hush, like the air was holding its breath. I laid there for a moment, staring at the dark fabric of my tent, trying to decide what it was that had woken me. My sleeping bag was still warm, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside. It wasn't windy, no rain either. The forest was just still. I reached out and grabbed my watch from where it sat in the mesh pocket beside my sleeping pad. It was 3:37 a.m. I'd gone to sleep a little after 10, dead tired after hiking in earlier that afternoon with a full pack. The plan was to spend 2 nights here, solo trip, nothing crazy. Just some peace and quiet away from everything. I had picked a flat spot near a small creek a few miles off trail in a part of national forest I'd never camped before. It wasn't remote by any big Alaskan standard or anything, but you wouldn't find crowds out here either. Maybe once or twice a week, someone would wander by, hunters, the occasional overzealous hiker. But most folks didn't bother coming this deep into the woods without a reason. I sat up and unzipped the inner layer of the tent. The outer rainfly was already tied back because the forecast was dry and warm. I leaned forward and looked through the screen, and my heart gave a little jump. Right there, maybe 4 feet from the tent entrance, were muddy footprints, clear as day. I blinked. I thought maybe I was dreaming at first or seeing things, but they were real. A trail of dark, wet prints leading out from the trees and circling around the fire pit. My fire had burned low by the time I turned in the night before, just glowing coals and ash. But even in the moonlight, I could see the contrast between the dirt and the dark patches of fresh mud. The prints weren't fresh enough to be shiny or still wet, but they hadn't been there when I went to bed. I was certain of that. I'd walked around that area barefoot, brushing off my pants and checking the last embers before zipping myself in for the night. And the strangest part? It hadn't rained in days. The ground was dry, dusty in places even. My boots had barely picked anything up on the way in. Yet here these prints were, dark, clumpy, like someone had walked in from a swamp. I unzipped the tent quietly, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out barefoot onto the dry dirt. The air was cool and I felt a slight chill run through me, not just from the temperature. My head was on a swivel scanning the woods. The footprints were wide and spaced apart. Whoever made them was walking slow, deliberate. I followed them with the beam of my flashlight, and they didn't go anywhere in particular. They circled the camp once, maybe twice, and ended right near the edge of the fire pit, just short of the burned logs I'd used to sit on earlier. Then they stopped. No trail out, no sign of return. I looked in the direction the prints came from, but it was just trees and undergrowth. No boot prints on the way in, no bare feet either. Just a ring of prints around my sight and nothing more. That's when I felt it, this tight pressure, like I wasn't alone. Not just the usual wariness you get when you're alone in the woods, but something heavier. The feeling of being watched. It was the way the hair on your arms stands up, how your stomach turns a little. I scanned the trees with the flashlight, slow and steady, the way I was taught back when I worked trails in Yellowstone. Wide sweep, don't jerk the beam around, pause at shadows. But there was nothing, just trunks and brush and the slow drift of mist beginning to gather low in the cool air. I backed up toward the tent. I wasn't thinking clearly, but every instinct told me not to turn my back. I wasn't about to start yelling or asking who was out there either. That only works in movies. If someone wanted me to know they were there, they would have made a point. This, whatever this was, felt intentional, quiet, deliberate. Back in the tent, I slipped my boots on and grabbed my knife from beside the sleeping bag. I wasn't going to use it, probably wouldn't even take it out unless I had to, but having it made me feel slightly less exposed. I sat there, staring at the wall of my tent, listening. Nothing. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. The forest was completely silent. That's what finally got to me. Silence. Even at night, you should hear the occasional scurry of a squirrel, the flutter of a bird repositioning itself on a branch, frogs near the water, wind rustling leaves. But there was nothing. Not even the creek made its usual babbling noise. It was like everything had shut down. Hiding. I couldn't stay. That much was clear. Something wasn't right. Whether it was a person or something else, I didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I started packing up fast but quiet, rolling my sleeping bag, stuffing gear into my pack. No stove, no breakfast. I jammed everything in how it would fit. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears the entire time, louder than anything outside. Once I had everything packed and ready, I stepped back out and scanned the perimeter one more time. Nothing had changed. The prints were still there. No new ones, but the feeling hadn't left. I clipped the chest strap of my pack, turned on my headlamp, and started down the trail I'd come in on, heading back toward the logging road I'd parked off of. The trail was faint, not maintained, barely marked. I had flagged a few trees with orange tape on my way in, just to make sure I didn't get turned around in the underbrush. I wasn't in full panic mode, but I was close. The first 30 minutes of hiking were tense. Every stick snap, every shift of weight from a tree branch made me freeze. I was scanning for movement constantly, checking behind me every 100 feet. I didn't hear anything following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been just outside the edge of my vision, waiting. Eventually, I reached the creek crossing where I'd filled my water bottles the day before. I stopped there for a second, catching my breath and crouching low near the bank. The moonlight caught the surface of the water just enough to see it was moving again, softly trickling over the stones. I looked downstream, and my headlamp lit up something pale stuck in the weeds by the bank. first I thought it was trash, a scrap of plastic, maybe a bag someone had lost or left behind. But I got closer and realized it was a sock. A single white sock, wet, balled up like someone had taken it off in a hurry. I didn't touch it, didn't even get too close. I just stood there, staring at it. There weren't any other clothes, no pack, no gear. I backed away slowly and got moving again. It took me another hour and a half to reach my car. I was pushing hard through the dark, taking the straightest line I could manage between the flagged trees. The whole time, I felt like I had something behind me. Not close, just far enough that I couldn't hear or see, but close enough to make my skin crawl. When I finally saw the edge of the clearing where my car was parked, I almost broke into a run. But I held it together, got to the vehicle, threw my pack in the back, and unlocked the driver door with shaky hands. I sat there with the engine running for a solid minute before pulling away, headlights catching the edge of the forest and the start of the overgrown road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement 20 minutes later. Then I pulled over, got out, and walked around the car once, just to see if I was losing my mind. There were no footprints in the dust behind me, no sign of anyone following, nothing. I made it home that morning just after sunrise. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat. I sat at my kitchen table and tried to make sense of it. Muddy footprints, dry forest, a sock by the water, and a silence in the woods that didn't feel natural. I don't know if it was a drifter, some hermit or unstable person living off-grid. Maybe just some twisted person playing games. Maybe it was someone watching from a distance, curious about people who came through, not wanting to be seen. Whatever it was, they didn't leave trash, they didn't make noise, and they didn't take anything. They just circled my camp and vanished. I haven't been back to that area since. I still camp, still hike, but I'm more careful now. I always check the forecast. I study the terrain. I tell people where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never ignore that feeling in my gut, that tight knot that tells you something's off. Because that night it was, and I still don't have an answer for what was out there. But I know this, if something doesn't feel right in the woods, it probably isn't. I went out to camp alone for a few nights. I'd done solo camping before, nothing too crazy, just enough to feel far away from everything. This time, I picked a spot deep in a state forest I'd only been to once before. It wasn't a marked campground, just a flat area off an old fire road where I could set up my tent without anyone likely wandering past. I parked my car a couple miles down a dirt road, locked it up, threw on my pack, and hiked the rest of the way in. I got there late in the afternoon. The spot was surrounded by thick woods on all sides. No cell signal. I liked it that way. There were no sounds but the breeze in the trees, the occasional bird, maybe a squirrel or two digging around in the brush. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked a simple dinner, beans and rice. I brought a book with me, and I read a bit while the sun dipped low, then sat and watched the sky turn from blue to orange to deep black. The stars came out sharp and clear, and the temperature started to drop. By around 10, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. I doused it with water from my bottle, stirred the ashes around with a stick, then climbed into my sleeping bag inside the tent. It was quiet, so quiet it was almost loud. When you're that far from civilization, every little sound stands out. I laid there for a while just listening. I heard some distant cracking, maybe a deer walking through the brush, then some owl calls. The usual stuff, nothing that made me feel uneasy. It was close to midnight when I first heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was faint, like it was carried on the wind from a good distance off. I remember thinking it sounded like someone giggling, but it wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect to hear from someone sitting around a campfire. It didn't sound fun. It was quick and sharp and too high-pitched, almost like the person laughing didn't actually think anything was funny. They were just laughing for the sake of it, like they couldn't help themselves. And the way it bounced between the trees made it hard to tell where it was coming from. I froze and listened. My sleeping bag felt too tight suddenly, like it was trapping me. I unzipped it slowly, trying not to make any noise. The laughter stopped, then started again, a little louder this time. Still that same high-pitched, broken-up sound. It would go silent for a few seconds, then burst out again, always in short, sudden fits. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it toward the side of the tent the sound seemed to be coming from. The thin tent walls glowed with the beam, but nothing moved outside. I unzipped the flap, slowly poked my head out, and swept the light across the trees. Nothing, just trunks and branches, the underbrush rustling gently with the wind. But I still heard it. That damn laughter kept going off and on. I sat there for a while with the flashlight in one hand and a small knife in the other. I didn't know what I thought I'd do with it if something actually came out of the woods, but it felt better than having nothing. After a few minutes, the laughter shifted. It started to get lower, less like someone giggling and more like someone growling in their throat, but still broken up with short, stuttering bursts, like it was turning into something worse, less human. Still no ghosts or anything. I'm not saying it turned into a monster. I'm just saying it stopped sounding like a person who was joking around. It sounded like a person who had lost their mind. I sat there completely still. At some point, my flashlight flickered and went out. I smacked it a couple of times and it came back on, but it was dimmer now. My backup was in my pack outside the tent, and there was no way in hell I was stepping out there. The growling laughter kept going for what felt like forever. Maybe half an hour, maybe longer. I kept watching the woods through the tent flap, trying to see any kind of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no branches breaking. Just that awful sound, always just far enough away that I couldn't pin it down. Eventually it stopped. Just stopped. No fading away, no slowing down. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I sat up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand. My back hurt from leaning against the tent wall. My legs cramped up from sitting cross-legged so long. I kept telling myself I was being stupid, that it was probably someone drunk and wandering the woods, or maybe even an animal making weird sounds. But it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel like anything natural. Not supernatural, just not right. The sun finally started to rise. That early gray light came filtering through the trees, and it felt like I could breathe again. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cold, and the ground was damp with dew. Everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. I walked a few yards in the direction the sound had come from. I didn't go far, just enough to check the area. Nothing, just trees and ferns and a few fallen branches. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother trying to boil water for coffee. I shoved everything into my pack, rolled up the tent without even cleaning it out properly, and started walking back toward my car. I didn't run, but I walked quick, kept my knife in my hand the whole way. I don't think I looked up more than a few times the entire walk. I just watched the trail, kept moving, and listened. The forest was too quiet. When I got to my car, I locked the doors right away and just sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, catching my breath. Then I started the engine and drove out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the edge of town and found a gas station. I went inside, bought a coffee, and sat in the parking lot drinking it with shaking hands. It's been a couple years since that night. I still go camping, but I don't go alone anymore, and I don't go back to that forest. I've tried to explain the sound to other people, but I can't get it right. It wasn't some scary monster or ghost. It wasn't a wild animal. It was a human voice, at least I think it was, but there was something off about it. Something wrong in the way it sounded, like the person behind it wasn't right in the head. Or maybe they were trying to make me think they weren't. I've thought about it a lot. I've gone down all the rabbit holes: mental illness, someone high on something, maybe someone trying to scare me on purpose. But the thing is, I was miles from any road, let alone a house. And if it was someone just out there messing around, they would have had to hike in just like me in the dark, then hike back out without a light. That's not easy, not out there. And it would be dangerous for them too. There's no payoff for it. No camera to catch my reaction, no one to brag to. Just me, sitting in a tent, alone, terrified. So maybe it was someone who lived out there. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who watches, waits, and laughs when they're sure no one's going to believe what you heard. I still remember how it made my skin crawl, the way it bounced off the trees, how I couldn't tell how far away it was, how it didn't sound like it belonged in the forest. I've heard animals scream. I've heard foxes, bobcats, even raccoons make awful noises that sound almost human. This wasn't that. This had rhythm, intention, started as laughter, and it turned into something else. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods now, I still think I hear it. Not loud, not even enough to say for sure it's there. Just a hint of that high-pitched giggle carried by the wind. When that happens, I stop and listen. I stay still for a long minute, then I turn around and head back. I don't try to be brave about it. I don't wait to see what it turns into. I just go. I know what I heard, and I know I never want to hear it again. The wind had picked up by the time I reached my campsite, making the trees sway in a slow, groaning rhythm that set me on edge. I'd picked this place after a long day of hiking, far off trail, near an old fire road that hadn't seen traffic in years. I'd passed a rusted-out road barrier and followed a side path for another mile before settling on a flat clearing beside a deadfall, figuring it would block some of the wind. Didn't. Even with my back to the log and my tarp stretched low, the wind kept pushing through the trees, making everything feel alive. Not alive in the nice way, like birds and deer in the distance, but alive like something big was moving out there. I tried to shake the thought. It was just the wind. Trees always groan and creak in the wind, especially the older ones. But still, there was something about the way they bent, like they didn't want to stand upright anymore. I'd gotten to camp around 4:30 p.m., set up slowly, boiled water for dinner, and cleaned up while the last light of day slipped behind the hills. It was chilly, probably low 40s, and dropping. I put on my thermal base layers and climbed into my sleeping bag a little earlier than usual, figuring I'd read for a bit before falling asleep. I had my headlamp set to red light, my phone on airplane mode, and my little titanium cup next to me with the dregs of my tea still warm. That's when I heard it. A scream, not a bark, not a coyote, not a bird call. A scream, a woman's scream, distant but unmistakable. My first thought was that I imagined it. I took out my earbuds, though I hadn't had anything playing, and listened. Nothing, just the wind pushing through the forest, making the branches sway and knock together above me. Then it came again, clearer this time, maybe a quarter-mile away, uphill to the northwest. It didn't sound like someone in a horror movie. It sounded real, raw, sharp, like she was terrified or in pain. I sat straight up in my bag, my whole body on alert. I fumbled for my boots, yanked them on, then grabbed my flashlight and stood outside the tarp, listening. Another scream, this one a little closer. I didn't think. I just moved. My feet pounded against the ground as I jogged toward the sound, flashlight bouncing with each step, catching glimpses of bare trunks and underbrush. The wind had stripped away most of the leaves, so the woods were open but full of movement. Branches swaying, long grasses flattening, dead leaves fluttering everywhere. I don't know how far I ran. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe more. But the whole time, the scream got louder. Not just once, but several times, scattered across a few minutes. Then it stopped. Just gone. I kept going slower now. The trees here were a little thicker, and the wind didn't seem to reach the ground as much. It was quieter, too quiet. I stopped walking and clicked off my light. My breathing was loud in my ears, my heart still pounding. I stood there in the dark, listening, trying to hear anything. Nothing. No more screams. No voices. No cracking branches. No footsteps. Just the wind high above, brushing the tops of the trees. And then, after about a minute, a soft rustle, barely anything, came from behind me. I spun around, light on, scanning the trees. Just forest. Just the quiet flutter of a few dry leaves blowing across the ground. I called out even though I knew better. I didn't yell anything specific, just a kind of hey sound. Nothing answered. I stood there another few minutes, turning in slow circles, shining my light up into the trees, across the brush, at the forest floor. There was nothing. No tracks. No blood. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I waited a bit longer, then started walking back. I was slower now, and it felt like every other branch I passed tried to reach out and snag my jacket. I kept thinking I'd see someone, some woman in distress, or maybe hurt, but there was no one. Back at my campsite, the air felt colder. The tarp flapped a little, and my stuff was just how I'd left it. I sat on the log and waited again, half hoping I'd hear the scream again so I could figure out what was going on. But nothing came. Eventually, I climbed back under the tarp and lay down, not bothering to get undressed again. I left my boots on, my headlamp on my chest, and my hand on my knife. Sleep didn't come easy. The night dragged on. I dozed in short bursts. Every time the wind hit the trees, it felt like something moving. Every rustle became footsteps. Every creak was someone shifting weight. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something move past the tarp. But when I flashed my light, the woods were empty. Just the log, some fallen branches, and shadows. By dawn, I felt wired and dead tired at the same time. I got up stiffly, made coffee, and broke camp fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even brush my teeth. Just packed everything into my bag and started hiking back the way I'd come. There's something about walking out after a night like that. Like your senses are turned all the way up. Every sound hits you a little harder. I kept checking behind me, convinced someone was following, but no one was there. Just the sound of my own boots and the wind in the treetops. By the time I hit the old fire road, I'd convinced myself it was probably some teenagers messing around. Maybe a prank. Maybe someone playing a horror sound effect over a Bluetooth speaker. People do dumb stuff, but part of me didn't buy that. The scream felt too real, too desperate. I got back to my car around noon. The lot was empty. I hadn't seen a single person since yesterday morning. Just tracks from a few days ago, fading in the dirt. I drove into town, got gas, and stopped at a small diner off the main road. Sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs, trying to feel normal again. The waitress chatted with me a little, asked if I was out hunting. I told her I was just backpacking. She nodded and said I was the first one she'd seen come through in a week or so. Pretty quiet this time of year, she said. I asked her if she'd heard anything about people getting hurt out in the woods. Maybe a search and rescue call. She said no, nothing like that. Later that day, I called the non-emergency line for the sheriff's office just to report it. Figured it was the right thing to do. The woman who answered was polite but said they hadn't had any reports. She took my name and number just in case, but that was it. Days went by, then a week. I checked the local news online, searched for keywords, even looked up police logs. Nothing. No missing persons. No hiker in distress. No pranksters caught in the woods. Nothing. And that was what got to me. It would have made more sense if I just heard the scream once, or if it had been obviously fake. But it wasn't. I know what I heard. I know what fear sounds like. That was fear. Real fear. It's been months now, and I still think about that night more than I'd like. Not because I think I saw a ghost or something supernatural. Not because it was some twisted serial killer in the woods. What gets me is the not knowing. There was a scream, and then there was silence. I don't know who it was. I don't know what happened. I don't know if I could have helped, or if I was being lured into something bad myself. What I do know is that the forest has a way of swallowing things. Sound, light, people. And once something disappears out there, it's like it was never there to begin with. Now, every time I head out into the backcountry, especially when the wind picks up, I think about that scream, and I keep my light close, my knife closer, because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't what you see, it's what you almost saw. I sat around the campfire, poking at the flames with the end of a charred stick, trying to ignore the unease creeping into my chest. The wood cracked and hissed as moisture deep in the logs boiled out. It was the only sound besides the occasional pop from the fire. Even the bugs had gone quiet. I don't know when I first noticed it, but it hit me all at once. The woods around me were too still. Not just quiet, but frozen. The usual night sounds I was used to, Crickets, tree frogs, rustling in the brush were gone. All I could hear was my own breathing and the fire. I tried to focus on the warmth of the flames and the slow-burning log at the center, its red edges glowing like embers under a heavy breath. I told myself it was just nerves. I'd been alone in the woods before. I'd done solo camps plenty of times. It was something I actually liked doing. Just me, a small tent, some basic gear, and no one else around for miles. But this time felt different, and I couldn't explain why. I was in a national forest, about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road. I'd hiked in the day before, found a flat, sheltered spot near a small creek, set up camp, and spent most of the day fishing and walking along game trails. I hadn't seen another person since I parked my truck. That was part of the appeal, solitude. But now, as the night dragged on and the fire dimmed, I started to wish I wasn't alone. I scanned the tree line again, not moving my head too fast, trying to make it seem like I was just admiring the night. But my eyes were searching. The woods were a black wall beyond the ring of firelight. The trees were tall and narrow, pine and fir mostly, with just enough space between them that I should have been able to see movement if there was any. But nothing moved. Then I saw it. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Just a dark shape, barely visible, standing still just outside the fire's reach. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still there. My heart jumped. It didn't move. It just stood there, like it was watching me. It was too far away to see details, maybe 30, 40 feet out, but I could tell it was human-shaped. Tall, narrow shoulders, arms at its sides. I told myself it was a tree stump. A weird one, maybe half-rotted and shaped just right to look like a person in the dark. But something about it was off. My eyes adjusted more, and the shape didn't change. It wasn't hunched like a stump or a deadfall. It was straight like someone standing tall. It didn't sway in the breeze. It didn't shift weight from foot to foot. It didn't breathe. That's what got me. There was no movement. Even a person standing still would fidget, sway slightly. This thing was frozen. I didn't move. My stick dropped from my hand, and I sat completely still, staring at it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and a tightness in my throat. My breathing slowed as I tried to quiet everything. Sound, motion, even my thoughts. I didn't want to startle it or whatever it was. I just wanted to figure out if I was imagining things. I reached slowly, quietly, toward the ground next to me where I kept my flashlight and my small hatchet. My fingers found the flashlight first. I didn't turn it on right away. I just held it, feeling its cold metal in my palm, letting the weight of it steady me. I figured I had two options: shine the light and see what it really was, or sit there all night pretending I didn't see it. I chose the light. With a quick flick of my thumb, the beam cut through the darkness and hit the trees. I swept it back and forth fast, heart racing. When I passed over the spot where the figure had been, I stopped. There was nothing there. My chest tightened. I stood up, shining the light around in wide arcs, stepping carefully toward the spot, listening. Nothing, just trees and pine needles and some underbrush. I walked all the way to where the figure had been and circled the area. No footprints, no broken branches, no trail. I told myself again it must have been a trick of the light or my mind playing games. I turned off the flashlight and walked slowly back to camp, eyes wide and alert, flashlight ready in case I needed it again. When I got back to the fire, I sat down and added another log. The flame flared back up, throwing long shadows. I didn't see anything else that night, but I didn't sleep either. I just sat there with the hatchet in my lap and the flashlight in my hand, staring at the woods, waiting. Morning came slow and cold. When the sun finally cut through the trees, I packed up camp faster than I ever had. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't make coffee. I just stuffed everything into my pack, took one last look at the woods, and started hiking back to my truck. That should have been the end of it. Just a weird night and a spooked brain. But it wasn't. About halfway back to the truck, I noticed something off on the trail. It wasn't anything obvious. Just a feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Then I found the boot print. It was fresh, Too fresh. The heel was deep and the edges clean, like it had been made that morning. I stopped and crouched down to get a better look. It was larger than my boot, and the tread pattern was different, flat like an old work boot. It pointed in the direction I had just come from. Someone had been walking behind me. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. I stood up and picked up my pace. I didn't run. I didn't want to seem like prey, but I moved fast. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, every bird call made me jump. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my pack in the bed, slammed the tailgate, and got behind the wheel. The silence in the cab felt like a wall between me and whatever was out there. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove. That was 3 years ago. I haven't solo camped since. But there's more. A couple of months ago, I was talking to a guy I work with, just killing time during lunch, and I mentioned that trip. I didn't tell him all the details, just that I'd gotten spooked and hadn't gone solo since. He looked at me weird and asked where I'd been camping. When I told him the general area, his face changed. He got real quiet for a second, then said, "Man, I think my cousin had something happen out that way. Something with a guy living in the woods. Real backwoods type. Wouldn't talk, wouldn't leave people alone." I asked what he meant. He told me his cousin and a couple buddies had gone out there to hunt. One of them spotted a man standing way off in the trees, just watching. They thought it was a ranger or maybe another hunter at first, but he didn't move, didn't talk, just stood there. They packed up and left early. His cousin said the guy followed them for miles, just out of sight. Always behind them, never close, but always there. I haven't stopped thinking about that since. There was no ghost, no monster, just a man. Someone living out there in the deep woods. Someone who knew how to move without being heard, how to watch without being seen, and who didn't want company. I don't know if he meant harm, or if he just liked watching. But he was real. I know that much. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I park in remote areas to hike with friends or stop for a break in the woods, I get that same feeling. That hush, that unnatural stillness. And I wonder if he's still out there, watching someone else's firelight, just outside the reach of the flame.